Albert Anastasia. October 25, 1957, New York City. Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared mob bosses in America, walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop for a morning shave. Known as the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia had risen from the Brooklyn docks to become head of Murder, Inc., the Mafia's notorious enforcement arm, and boss of what would become the Gambino crime family. His power came from fear. He controlled the waterfront through violence, extortion, and hundreds of mob-ordered killings. But by the late 1950s, his brutality had turned allies into enemies. Rival bosses, including Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, decided Anastasia was too reckless and too dangerous. That morning, as he reclined in the barber's chair, two masked gunmen rushed in. They shoved the barber aside and opened fire. Caught off guard, Anastasia leapt forward in confusion, striking at the mirror's reflection, thinking it was his attackers. Seconds later, he collapsed to the floor, riddled with bullets. The assassination shocked the underworld. With Anastasia gone, Carlo Gambino seized control, transforming his crime family into the most powerful in America. The Park Sheraton barbershop hit became one of the most infamous mob killings in history, marking the violent end of an era and the ruthless rise of a new order. Paul Castellano. On December 16, 1985, Manhattan became the stage for one of the most famous mob assassinations in history. Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, had ruled since 1976, taking over after Carlo Gambino's death. Known as Big Paul, he built his empire on white-collar crimes, labor racketeering, construction kickbacks, and loan sharking, running the family more like a corporation than a street crew. But his style of leadership created enemies. Many Gambino members felt shut out, especially John Gotti, a rising capo who controlled the family's most profitable crews. By late 1985, tensions had reached a breaking point. Castellano had skipped the funeral of Agnello Della Croce, the family's longtime underboss and Gotti's mentor. To the rank and file, it was seen as an insult. Meanwhile, federal indictments loomed over Castellano, and rumors spread that he might cut deals with prosecutors. For Gotti and his allies, the time to act had come. That evening, Castellano and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti, arrived at Sparks Steakhouse for what they believed was a business dinner. As their black Lincoln pulled up to the curb around 5:30 p.m., four gunmen disguised in trench coats and Russian-style hats rushed forward. In seconds, gunfire erupted. Castellano and Bellotti collapsed on the sidewalk, killed instantly in front of stunned bystanders. From a car down the block, John Gotti watched the hit unfold. Within days, he declared himself acting boss. By January 1986, he was the undisputed head of the Gambino family. The murder of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse marked a violent transfer of power, cementing John Gotti's rise and leaving behind one of the most notorious mob hits in American history. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was gunned down on June 20, 1947, in Beverly Hills, California. A founding member of Murder, Inc. and a powerful figure in the Luciano crime family, Siegel had climbed from the violent streets of New York to the glamorous world of Hollywood. He lived among stars and socialites, but behind the charm was a ruthless gangster who made his fortune through bootlegging, gambling, and racketeering. By the mid-1930s, Bugsy had relocated to California, expanding the mob's influence on the West Coast. Yet his greatest gamble came in Las Vegas. Backed by syndicate money, he took over the Flamingo Hotel project. What began as a dream resort quickly spiraled out of control. Costs ballooned from $1 million to over $6 million, and whispers spread that Bugsy and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, were skimming from the project. The Flamingo opened in December 1946, but its shaky start only fueled the mob's anger. On that June night in 1947, Bugsy was sitting in Hill's Beverly Hills home, reading the Los Angeles Times, when gunfire shattered the window. A .30 caliber carbine sprayed the room, striking him multiple times. Siegel died instantly, his body collapsing across the couch. Within hours, word reached Las Vegas. By the next day, his associates Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum had seized control of the Flamingo, running it profitably under new management. The murder of Bugsy remains officially unsolved, but few doubt it was sanctioned by the mob. His violent death sent a message. In organized crime, no one, no matter how powerful or glamorous, was beyond reach. His empire ended in blood, but Las Vegas went on to become the mob's most lucrative stronghold. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. Joseph Colombo. On June 28, 1971, Joe Colombo, boss of the Colombo crime family, stood before thousands at Columbus Circle in Manhattan. It was the second rally of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, the organization he had founded to protest FBI harassment and defend the image of Italian Americans. For the first time, a New York mob boss wasn't hiding in the shadows. Colombo was on stage, playing the role of activist and community leader. But that visibility came at a cost. Rival mobsters feared his public crusade was drawing unwanted attention, and law enforcement had already placed him under intense scrutiny. As Colombo moved through the crowd, a 24-year-old man named Jerome Johnson approached, disguised as a photographer. Without warning, Johnson pulled out a revolver and fired 3 shots into Colombo's head and neck at point-blank range. Chaos erupted as supporters screamed and ran for cover. Within seconds, Johnson himself was gunned down by an unidentified man, leaving behind a storm of unanswered questions. Colombo collapsed, gravely wounded but alive. He would never recover. For the next 7 years, he remained paralyzed, trapped in a near-vegetative state until his death on May 22, 1978. Officially, police concluded Johnson acted alone. But many inside the underworld suspected a larger conspiracy. Some pointed to rival mobster Joe Gallo, who had recently clashed with Colombo over control of the family. The shooting ended Colombo's reign and fractured his organization. The once powerful league quickly unraveled, and the family descended into internal warfare. In a single violent moment, the man who had tried to merge organized crime with public activism was silenced, becoming another casualty in the bloody history of New York's mob wars. Dutch Schultz. On October 23, 1935, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, sat down for dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Schultz had risen from the Bronx underworld to become one of the most powerful mob bosses of the Prohibition era, controlling breweries, speakeasies, and later the Harlem Numbers racket. His empire was built on fear and violence, with rivals like Legs Diamond and Vincent Mad Dog Call eliminated in bloody turf wars. By the mid-1930s, Schultz was facing relentless federal prosecution, and he became increasingly unstable. Most alarming to the Mafia Commission, he openly plotted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, the man threatening to dismantle his empire. The commission ruled that such a reckless move would bring federal heat on all of organized crime. Their solution was final. Schultz had to be eliminated. That night in Newark, hitmen from Murder Inc. Charles Workman and Mendy Weiss entered the Chop House and opened fire. Schultz was struck in the stomach and collapsed in the men's room, while 3 of his associates were fatally wounded. Despite massive internal injuries, he lingered for nearly 22 hours, drifting in and out of delirium before dying on October 24, 1935. The fall of Dutch Schultz ended one of the most violent reigns of the Prohibition era and reinforced the power of the Mafia Commission. His assassination proved a simple truth in the underworld. Even the most feared gangster could be brought down when he became a liability. Carmine Galante, one of New York's most feared mob bosses, met his violent end on July 12, 1979, in Bushwick, Brooklyn. That afternoon, Galante was dining at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant, sitting outside in the garden with his bodyguards and close associates. Galante had risen through the Bonanno crime family as a ruthless enforcer, eventually becoming its de facto leader. He was notorious for his iron grip on the heroin trade, importing and distributing narcotics on a massive scale. His ambition to dominate the drug business brought him enormous profits, but it also isolated him from the other New York crime families. Galante ignored the Mafia's ruling commission and openly declared himself untouchable, a move that sealed his fate. The commission, made up of leaders from rival families, quietly authorized his murder. Even his own Sicilian bodyguards, known as Zips, were complicit in the plot. On that summer afternoon, 3 masked gunmen stormed into the restaurant's garden and opened fire with pistols and shotguns. Galante was hit multiple times and died instantly, slumped in his chair with his trademark cigar still clenched between his teeth. 2 others, including the restaurant owner, were also killed in the ambush. The assassination removed a destabilizing force in the Mafia world and restored control of the Bonanno family to leaders who played by the Commission's rules. Salvatore Maranzano. On September 10, 1931, New York City witnessed the violent end of Salvatore Maranzano, the man who had briefly crowned himself the most powerful mob boss in America. Born in Sicily in 1868, Maranzano immigrated to the United States and became a central figure in the bloody Castellamarese War, a gangland conflict that raged from 1930 to 1931. After his rival Joe Masseria was killed earlier that year, Maranzano seized control, reorganizing the Mafia into what became known as the Five Families. He declared himself capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses, believing he could rule the underworld with absolute authority. But Maranzano's reign was short-lived. His traditional old-world style clashed with the ambitions of younger mobsters like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, who envisioned a modern criminal syndicate run like a business. When Luciano learned that Maranzano had secretly ordered a plot to kill him, he moved first. That afternoon, 4 Jewish hitmen working with Luciano and Lansky entered Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue, disguised as federal tax agents. Once inside, they pulled their weapons, stabbing and shooting the boss to death in a swift and merciless attack. The murder of Salvatore Maranzano ended the era of the so-called boss of bosses. In its place, Luciano established the Commission, a governing council of mob leaders designed to share power and prevent another war. Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was one of the most influential mob figures in mid-20th century America. On May 2, 1957, inside the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building, his power was nearly cut short. That night, as Costello walked toward the elevator of the Majestic on Central Park West, a young enforcer named Vincent Chin Gigante stepped forward and fired a single shot on orders from rival boss Vito Genovese. The bullet grazed Costello's scalp, knocking him to the ground. Dazed but still conscious, he managed to survive. When questioned by police, Costello refused to identify his shooter, muttering that he could not recognize the man. This silence allowed Gigante to walk free in court the following year, but the attempt had already done its work. Costello had long built his empire on gambling rackets, political influence, and a careful avoidance of open violence. But by the late 1950s, his hold on the Luciano crime family was slipping. Senate hearings had exposed him to the public, and his refusal to dive into narcotics trafficking left ambitious rivals circling. Genovese seized the moment, using the failed hit to push Costello into retirement. Though he survived the bullet, Costello's reign was over. Genovese emerged as the new boss, and the family took his name: Angelo Bruno. On March 21, 1980, the calm of South Philadelphia was shattered when Angelo Bruno, the longtime boss of the Philadelphia crime family, was gunned down. Known as the Gentle Don for his preference for diplomacy over violence, Bruno had led the family since 1959, keeping order by discouraging narcotics and focusing on gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. His quiet, measured rule brought stability, but it also bred resentment among ambitious subordinates who wanted the quick riches of the drug trade. That tension erupted on the night of his murder. After returning home, Bruno sat in the passenger seat of his car outside 933 Snyder Avenue. Without warning, a shotgun blast tore through the window, striking him in the back of the head and killing him instantly. His driver, John Stanfa, sat beside him, unharmed but frozen in shock. The hit was orchestrated by Bruno's own consigliere, Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponegro, who wrongly believed he had the Mafia Commission's blessing to remove his boss and seize power. But Caponegro's move was a fatal miscalculation. Within weeks, his body was found stuffed in a car trunk in the Bronx, naked and battered. A brutal message from the Commission that unsanctioned killings would not be tolerated. Other conspirators soon met similar fates. Bruno's assassination ended an era of relative calm in Philadelphia and plunged the family into years of violent internal warfare. The murder of Angelo Bruno remains one of the most notorious mob hits of the 20th century, marking the downfall of a boss who tried to rule with restraint but was undone by the very underworld he sought to control. Joe Gallo. On April 7, 1972, Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo met a violent end in Manhattan's Little Italy. Gallo, born in Brooklyn in 1929, was a feared and unpredictable figure in the Colombo crime family. By the early 1960s, he had already carved a reputation for violence when he kidnapped 4 top men of boss Joe Profaci, sparking the bloody First Colombo War. His ambition and refusal to follow Mafia tradition made him both dangerous and unstable in the eyes of his rivals. Convicted of extortion in 1961, Gallo spent nearly a decade in prison. When he returned to the streets in 1971, he styled himself as a rebel, reaching out to African American and Puerto Rican gangs and cultivating a media image as a gangster apart from the old ways. His demands for money and influence put him on a collision course with Joseph Colombo and his allies, igniting the Second Colombo War. The feud reached its climax in the early hours of his 43rd birthday. After celebrating at Umberto's Clam House, gunmen burst inside and opened fire. Gallo tried to shield his family, overturned a table, and staggered into the street before collapsing from fatal wounds. Though suspicions pointed toward Colombo loyalists, the true architect of the hit has never been definitively proven. What is certain is that Crazy Joe's death closed the chapter on one of the Mafia's most flamboyant and defiant figures, his violent end marking the price of challenging both his enemies and the traditions of the mob. Tony Spilotro. In June 1986, the saga of Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro, one of the Chicago outfit's most feared enforcers, came to a violent end. Born in Chicago in 1938, Spilotro had risen through the ranks as a ruthless hitman before being sent west in the 1970s to oversee the outfit's interests in Las Vegas. There, he managed the casino skimming operations at the Stardust, Fremont, Hacienda, and Marina, while also running a burglary crew infamously known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang. His brutality made him notorious, but his reckless behavior and mounting indictments turned him into a liability for his bosses. By 1986, federal charges for racketeering and conspiracy loomed, and outfit leaders convened to decide his fate. On June 14th, Tony and his brother Michael were lured to a suburban home in Bensenville, Illinois, under the pretense of a meeting. Instead, they were beaten to death in the basement. Days later, on June 22nd, their bodies were discovered buried in a cornfield near Enos, Indiana, their deaths carried out by men they once trusted. The murders shocked the underworld, marking the outfit's brutal method of silencing a liability. Decades later, in the Operation Family Secrets trial, Chicago bosses, including James Marcello, were convicted for ordering the killings. Tony Spilotro's rise and fall became the basis for Nicholas Pileggi's book Casino and the Martin Scorsese film of the same name. His violent end underscored an unavoidable truth of mob life. When loyalty falters, the outfit buries its own. Johnny Torrio. January 24th, 1925. Chicago was a city boiling with gang rivalries when Johnny Torrio, the mastermind of the Chicago outfit and mentor to Al Capone, stepped out of his car after returning from a shopping trip with his wife. Torrio was no ordinary gangster. He had built a criminal empire through bootlegging, gambling, and vice, operating with a calm strategy that earned him the nickname The Fox. But his decision to orchestrate the murder of Northside Gang leader Dean O'Banion the previous year had set in motion a chain of events that would nearly cost him his life. As Torrio reached his apartment, Northside gunmen Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and Vincent Drucci lay in wait. They opened fire, riddling him with bullets that struck his jaw, lungs, and abdomen. Collapsing to the ground, Torrio's fate seemed sealed. Moran moved in for the final shot, but in a twist of luck, his gun jammed. That single malfunction spared Torrio's life and altered the balance of Chicago's underworld. Torrio survived the ambush after weeks in the hospital, but the attack shattered his will to continue. By the end of 1925, he stepped down, handing full control of the outfit to Al Capone. The hit on Johnny Torrio didn't just end his reign, it marked the rise of Capone and set the stage for the bloody gang wars that would define Chicago's Prohibition era. Giuseppe Morello. On August 15, 1930, New York's underworld witnessed the fall of Giuseppe Morello, the man remembered as the first boss of the American Mafia. Born in Corleone, Sicily, in 1867 and known as the Clutch Hand because of a deformed right arm, Morello built his empire in Italian Harlem during the early 1900s. He commanded counterfeiting rings, extortion rackets, and brutal enforcement crews, earning a reputation as one of the most feared figures in organized crime. By the late 1920s, Morello had returned to power as chief advisor to Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria during the Castellamarese War, a bloody struggle against Salvatore Maranzano for control of New York's Mafia. Morello's decades of experience made him invaluable, but also placed a target on his back. On that August afternoon in East Harlem, as Morello collected receipts at his office, gunmen from Maranzano's faction stormed in. He and his associate Joseph Periano were cut down in a hail of gunfire. Witnesses later identified the shooter as a Castellamarese hitman known only as Buster from Chicago. Morello's death was a devastating blow to Masseria's camp and a turning point in the war. It marked the violent end of the Mafia's first boss, a man whose rise helped shape American organized crime, but whose fall proved that in the world he created, no one was beyond reach. Frankie Yale, born Francesco Ioele in Italy in 1893, rose to power as one of Brooklyn's most feared mob bosses during Prohibition. By the 1920s, he controlled speakeasies, racketeering, and extortion operations, all while maintaining strong ties with Johnny Torrio and a young Al Capone, who once worked as a bouncer in Yale's club. Yale supplied Capone with Canadian whiskey, but their relationship soured when Capone suspected him of hijacking liquor shipments meant for Chicago. Yale's violent reputation had already made him notorious. He was linked to labor rackets and suspected in the 1924 Chicago assassination of Northside gangster Dean O'Banion. By 1928, betrayal and mistrust placed a target squarely on his back. On July 1, 1928, Yale received a phone call that lured him out of his Brooklyn home. Driving his Lincoln Coupe through Bath Beach, he was pursued by a car of gunmen. At 44th Street and 14th Avenue, they opened fire with a shotgun and Thompson submachine gun, the first time such a weapon was used in a New York mob killing. Yale's car careened into a stoop, and he died instantly. When police searched the abandoned getaway car, they found a shotgun and a Thompson submachine gun, later linked ballistically to the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Suspicion immediately fell on Capone, though no charges were ever brought. Yale's death sent shockwaves through the underworld. His funeral was lavish, with thousands lining the streets of Brooklyn to watch as his silver casket was carried to its grave. But his empire collapsed overnight, and his assassination marked the bloody beginning of a new era, where machine guns, not handshakes, would decide the future of organized crime. Joe Aiello was one of Al Capone's deadliest rivals during Prohibition. Born in Sicily, he rose through Chicago's underworld, running rackets and eventually becoming president of the powerful Unione Siciliana. By the late 1920s, Aiello was locked in a bitter war with Capone, plotting assassination attempts and striking alliances with Bugs Moran and other enemies of the outfit. Aiello was tied to the murders of Antonio Lombardo in 1928 and Pasqualino Lolordo in 1929, both Capone allies who had held the presidency of the Unione Siciliana before him. Each killing escalated the violence, placing Aiello high on law enforcement's list of Chicago's most dangerous gangsters. In April 1930, he was officially named the city's #1 public enemy, above even Capone himself. But his power was slipping. Capone's organization was larger, richer, and deadlier. On October 23, 1930, Aiello stepped out of a North Side apartment on Colmar Avenue. Waiting for him were Capone's gunmen. In a hail of submachine gun fire, Aiello was struck 59 times, collapsing in the street. His death marked the end of one of the bloodiest rivalries in Chicago's mob history. With Aiello gone, Capone's dominance over the city was absolute, and another violent chapter of the Prohibition era had come to a close. Big Jim Colosimo. In May 1920, Chicago's criminal underworld was rocked by the assassination of James Big Jim Colosimo, one of the city's earliest crime bosses. Born in Italy and raised in Chicago, Colosimo built his fortune through vice, running gambling dens, brothels, and protection rackets. By the 1910s, he had established himself as the powerful head of the city's organized crime network, operating openly from his own Colosimo's Cafe on South Wabash Avenue. When Prohibition approached, Johnny Torrio, his protege and trusted enforcer from New York, pushed to move into bootlegging. But Colosimo, already wealthy from vice, refused to risk the attention that alcohol smuggling would bring. That refusal created a deadly rift. On May 11, 1920, Colosimo was lured to his cafe under the pretense of meeting a shipment. As he entered, a gunman hiding inside the vestibule stepped forward and fired a shotgun blast, killing him instantly. The hit was widely believed to have been ordered by Torrio, eager to seize control and lead the outfit into the bootlegging trade. Some accounts claim the triggerman was Brooklyn gangster Frankie Yale, though it was never proven. The murder of Big Jim Colosimo marked the first major mob hit of Chicago's Prohibition era. His death cleared the way for Torrio, and later Al Capone, to build an empire that would dominate organized crime in America for decades to come. Antonio Lombardo, known as Tony the Scourge, was born in Sicily in 1891 and rose to prominence in Chicago during Prohibition. A close ally of Al Capone, Lombardo became president of the powerful Unione Siciliana in 1925, an organization that gave him both political influence and enemies. His decision to open the group to non-Sicilian Italians and his loyalty to Capone sparked the fury of rival boss Joe Aiello, who coveted the position for himself. On September 7, 1928, Lombardo left his office near Madison and Dearborn Streets in downtown Chicago. As he walked with his bodyguard, gunmen lying in wait opened fire in broad daylight. Bullets ripped through the crowded street, striking Lombardo multiple times. He collapsed on the sidewalk, dying instantly, while his bodyguard also fell under the hail of gunfire. The murder was widely attributed to Joe Aiello and his allies in the North Side Gang, determined to break Capone's hold on the Unione Siciliana. Lombardo's assassination not only eliminated Capone's closest advisor, but also escalated the violent mob wars of the late 1920s. Within months, the bloodshed would culminate in one of the most infamous episodes in organized crime history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Benjamin Fine was one of New York's first and most feared labor racketeers. Born around 1889 on the Lower East Side, Fine grew up in the rough world of Manhattan's immigrant streets. By the early 1910s, he had carved out power in the garment district, running crews of hired sluggers who used fists, clubs, and guns to enforce strikes or break them, depending on who paid the most. His nickname, Dopey Benny, came from his half-closed eyes caused by a medical condition. But behind that look was a calculating figure who pioneered labor racketeering. At his height, Fine earned thousands a week from union bosses and factory owners desperate for protection. He controlled contracts, demanded fees, and crushed rivals in the bloody labor slugger wars that raged from 1911 to 1917. The violence reached a peak with shootouts like the 1913 Grand and Forsyth Street Battle and the 1914 Arlington Hall gunfight that left an innocent court clerk dead. But Fine's reign began to unravel when he turned state's witness in 1915, testifying against other gang leaders in exchange for leniency. That betrayal destroyed his standing in the underworld. By the 1920s, his power had faded, and the old guard of labor sluggers was being replaced by the rising Mafia families. In 1931, Fine was arrested again for assault and robbery, an echo of his violent past, but this time he was no longer untouchable. Though he survived the era when so many mobsters were gunned down, Fine's influence was gone. He lived quietly into the 1960s, remembered less as a boss than as a relic of New York's violent beginnings in organized crime. Anthony Castellitto was a rising force within the Teamsters Union during the early 1960s, serving as secretary-treasurer of Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey. He was well-liked by rank-and-file members and represented a serious challenge to the dominance of Anthony Provenzano, the feared Genovese crime family captain who controlled the Union through violence and intimidation. That rivalry turned deadly. On June 5, 1961, Castellitto was lured to his fishing cottage in Carehongson, New York. There, on Provenzano's orders, he was ambushed, beaten, and strangled to death. Prosecutors later revealed that mob enforcer Harold Koenigsberg was paid $15,000 to carry out the hit, while Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio helped dispose of the body, rumored to have been destroyed in a wood chipper, leaving it never to be recovered. The murder removed the last significant obstacle to Provenzano's total control of Local 560. With Castellito gone, Provenzano tightened his grip on the union's pension funds, trucking contracts, and political influence, enriching the Genovese family for years. Salvatore Testa, born March 31, 1956, in southwest Philadelphia, was once known as the crowned prince of the Philadelphia mob. The son of Philip the Chicken Man Testa, who briefly became boss after Angelo Bruno's assassination in 1980, Salvatore inherited his father's violent world after Philip was killed by a nail bomb in March 1981. In the bloody power struggle that followed, Salvi rose quickly through the ranks, eventually serving as a capo and later acting underboss. Feared on the streets, Testa built a reputation as a ruthless enforcer and was linked to more than 15 murders, including the revenge killing of Rocco Boom Boom Marinucci, the man responsible for his father's death. His reputation for survival was equally legendary. He walked away from no fewer than 17 assassination attempts, once even surviving a shotgun blast outside a Philadelphia pizza shop while eating raw clams. Among his peers, he was considered almost untouchable, but inside the family, his power and ambition became a threat. Boss Nicodemo, Little Nicky. Scarfo grew paranoid of Testa's growing influence and even resented him for breaking off an engagement to his underboss's daughter. By 1984, Scarfo had decided the crowned prince had to go. On September 14, 1984, Testa was lured into a trap by his supposed friends. Shot execution style in the back of the head, his body was dumped in Gloucester Township, New Jersey. 6 days later, around 300 mourners attended his funeral, a striking farewell for a man once seen as the mob's future. Salvatore Testa's death was more than the end of a feared hitman. It was a reminder that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was fleeting and survival was never guaranteed. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.